So sorry about that. With the joint authorization board, the process is largely manual. The reviewers and teams are interpreting requirements differently and apply policy differently. So we have three different legacy JAB agencies: GSA, DoD, and DHS. You have reviewers from each of those respective agencies, not necessarily even from the same contracting firm, and each with different experiences. And so trying to get those reviewers on the same page can be difficult at times. The significant change approval process is too slow. It's not keeping up with the speed of cloud innovation. Agency customers cannot necessarily see the status of things until it's approved, and that causes delays in their ability to make risk-based decisions. And then performance management escalations are not necessarily timely. There's some lag between the time that a CAP is warranted, a corrective action plan is warranted for a particular item that a cloud service experiences, and the time that CAP letter is actually released and talked about and formulated, signed, and released. Next slide. And so we have along with the challenges, we have some opportunities. And so we have to recognize, first of all, that there are two specific aspects to continuous monitoring. One is compliance with FedRAMP requirements, and the other is the risk management aspect, for which the authorizing officials are responsible for. And so based on the legislation, and we're re-examining the FedRAMP's role in ConMon oversight for all FedRAMP authorized CSOs. And to address this, FedRAMP is establishing a continuous monitoring lane within the PMO, a lane that hasn't existed before. And we're in the process of hiring a federal professional to lead that. So when we see opportunities, we see they fall into two specific buckets. Okay, there are opportunities that we can address through automation, standardizing OSCAL data formats to allow for integration with agency GRC tooling, automated notification and alerting of CSPs of deliverables and current status, automation of ConMon alerts on vulnerabilities that are past reporting timelines, things of that nature. But in addition to applying technology and automation, we understand that there's also process improvements that we have to address or should be addressing as well. So for instance, a knowledge management system to ensure consistency and application of requirements and policy across the board. One of the things I tell my team frequently is we need to apply FedRAMP policy in a firm, fair, and consistent manner with reptilian indifference. And so this knowledge management system will help ensure that consistency. We're also working to streamline the review, comment, and approval process for annual assessments and significant changes. Again, there are some the timely issue for cloud providers who want to get the changes into their systems and approved so agencies can onboard them, agency customers can onboard them, is critical. The big one is reducing manual efforts and focusing on critical security analysis. A while ago, FedRAMP worked with CISA GovCar and did a threat-based scoring of the controls in the Rev 4, and actually we did it for the Rev 5 FedRAMP baselines as well. And so one of the things that we're potentially looking at is using those threat-based controls to do control selection for annual assessments. In having conversations internally, we understand that there are some physical controls that aren't necessarily going to change. And just having a rational conversation about whether we need to look at those every 3 years or whatever the cadence may be. We're working to improve access to continuous monitoring data for agency authorizing officials. Again, looking at that two-pronged approach of FedRAMP compliance and providing information to agency authorizing officials so they can make better risk-based decisions, and also building consistency between the legacy JAB and the agency processes. As I outlined previously, the legacy JAB is more hands-on with continuous monitoring. They can do that because there's 50 some JAB authorized systems versus the 200 and some that are authorized by the agency. So we're trying to find a happy medium in between where agencies can be consumers of the vulnerability information that we see produced by the Joint Authorization Board reviewers, and help those agency customers that have agency or that are leveraging agency authorized CSOs. And also, we want to increase our shared responsibility with collaborative continuous monitoring. So a couple of years ago, FedRAMP published a slick sheet basically on how CSPs can establish collaborative continuous monitoring. So some of the challenges that you can imagine where there's multiple agencies using the same same cloud provider. How do we best conduct continuous monitoring when there's two different AOs, two different levels of risk acceptance, so on and so forth. And so one of the things we did to address that initially was publish some guidance for cloud providers so they can establish collaborative conmon to help provide information to the agency authorizing officials. And the collaborative conmon was geared toward those cloud providers that have agency authorizations, because the legacy JAB is providing that information already. I think that's it. And I'm here for your questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brian. That was a very informative presentation. Now I will begin calling on members who have indicated that they have questions. Members, please raise your hand if you have a question, and I will call on you to unmute yourself based on the order in which you raise your hand. Please keep in mind this is the Q&A portion of our agenda, so in order to respect Brian's time, please try to use this time to ask your clarifying questions only. Any recommendations or suggestions you may have should be reserved for our discussion later in the agenda. Do we have any questions? Lamont, you have a question? Lamont, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. I didn't appreciate that. I wasn't in speaking mode. I just wanted a clarifying question, because I think I heard everything I wanted to hear. And thank you, Brian, for that. That was very detailed.
Sure.
Did I hear you accurately say that you're considering posturing some type of centralized automated solution for the conmon phase of the CSP authorization process?
So what we're doing is FedRAMP doesn't accept risk on any cloud provider that we authorize. But what we can do is two things. In the PMO, we can look at to make sure cloud providers are compliant with our requirements. For instance, if cloud providers don't report incidents, we can escalate that. If they are not turning in annual assessments at the appropriate time, we can escalate that. The risk management portion is on the agency authorizing officials, and what we're working towards ideally is providing vulnerability information as the JAB authorized CSPs see it out to all the agency authorized out to all the agency partners or customers of a cloud provider. So we've been working with CISA CDM as the distribution method. We have a lot of work to do yet on figuring out how we get that information collected and displayed for transmission out to the agency authorizing officials.
Right. So I guess you were saying no. And to your last point, would it be worthwhile to kind of posture something that, all the stakeholders could see it, even if it's not being reconciled at the FedRAMP PMO level?
Yeah, that's the intention. We want to push this information out to the agency authorizing officials.
Right. And I guess, again, finally, would that be in some automated fashion, I guess is what I'm
Yeah.
Okay.
So right now, the way the JAB works is they collect the scan data, we process it, and then develop what we call one pagers. And that one pager has a year's worth of history on the number of vulnerabilities, high, moderate, and low, that the cloud provider has. It's that type of information that we want to push out to the agency authorizing officials. Right now, once we authorize, once an agency signs an ATO and brings the package to FedRAMP, FedRAMP does its authorization. The negotiation is between the agency and the cloud provider directly on how they do continuous monitoring. How, are they getting those scan data, et cetera, and so forth. We want to help the agencies out by not having them have to do that, but by providing that information to them. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Great. Ravi, you're next.
Yes, Ravi Jagannathan, Palo Alto Networks. Hi, Brian. Wonderful presentation. So I have a clarifying question. So is the expectation is when the automation take place, you will be expecting, or the PMO will be expecting the both the SSP and the ConMon reports in OSCAL format?
Eventually, yes.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Marcy, your question is next.
Thank you. I had a question around kind of the SCR process and challenges that may be experienced there, specific to kind of like if an offering has, multiple agencies using it, who's really signing off on the SCR? Like, what do we kind of anticipate for improvement in the SCR process for maybe defining what is or isn't, and maybe agencies have different thresholds compared to even JABS threshold. So just really understanding more about challenges and potential moving forward for the SCR process.
Great question. Thank you, Marcy. No, that is a challenge and something that we've heard from cloud providers, at least for the past almost 5 years since I've been with the PMO, is, what constitutes a significant change. I think we have an opportunity here to reevaluate that, and also to make sure that, what we're asking cloud providers to do with regards to the rigor of a significant change is in fact a significant change. Understanding the sweet spot and the level of effort, where that is subject of discussion, and something that we're going to reach out to our partners on, both at the CSP and the 3 PAOs to help figure that out. The perennial challenge that you brought up is normalizing risk acceptance across multiple authorizing officials who may or may not have the same view on things. And so that is, as we go forward, trying to figure out how we FedRAMP in the PMO would adjudicate that, that and negotiate that space between an agency who doesn't approve of an SCR versus one that does. I think overall that's going to be some of the hardest work that we have. Is because we're trying to normalize, like I say, that risk acceptance. Did that answer your question, Marcy?
It did. It essentially, like, we recognize the issues, and there's a lot of work to be done in that, and it's complex work at that.
Yep. Because it's the human factor. The technical factor is much easier.
Agreed.
Great. Thank you. Jackie, your question is next.
I had a couple of questions for you, Brian. Good to see you again.
Likewise.
On the visibility of the CRs, have you, it never had occurred to me, because I approve the CRs for tons of these, right? Have we considered putting those or maybe it already is available to the authorizing officials that have access to the packages, or to flag that a CR has been approved on the FedRAMP marketplace, that we've got, artifacts so that people know that these changes have actually occurred and been authorized, and what those risks are?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's something that we do when we see most of the hyperscale providers who are adding services into their authorization boundary, and usually numerous services at once through the SCR process. Those services are typically listed with their offering in the marketplace. I think there's some space that we can do to find out how to communicate that better, and that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and my next comment was, you mentioned on the Conmon data, looking at size of the CDM tool. Have you considered, and is it part of the scope of your, I don't know if it's an RFC or a contract at this point, for your GRC tool, of ingesting that information into your GRC tool so that it can inform the Rev 5 controls, and then the risk can be flowed down from an inheritance perspective, having it in a separate tool as opposed to in the GRC and or both, but having it apart from the GRC makes it very difficult to infer the risk and inform the packages that inherit from the offering.
I would have to go back and review the requirements that we're working on for our technical solution.
Okay. And my last one is, have you looked at options to drive down the cost and the manpower associated with the current manual Conmon?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the reasons why we're looking at automated solutions to do that. We don't know exactly what those look like right now because we're in the process of formulating requirements. But we understand that, for every, time of an FTE that we can save on the manual process, that can be freed up for other work. And so we understand that, maintaining spreadsheets and POAMs on the part of the cloud providers is very manually intensive, is labor intensive as well. So we're looking at that's what we intend to do, is look for ways to save that on manual effort.
Have you looked at an interim solution until we get to the automation?
No, we haven't.
Okay. And just as a data point, I think we've talked about this, is every 20 cloud providers that we add costs $1.3 million to just do Conmon. And that's a pretty substantial cost that's being incurred. And so probably agencies don't have quite as many authorizations as we do. DHS probably, and one of the health one, HHS, does a lot, but I mean, that's a pretty substantial cost. And so I would just ask that be looked at.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Brian.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, great. Bronco, you're next.
Hey, Brian, good to see you. Thanks for the brief. I just want to make sure that I understand. And again, continuous monitoring is one thing that we've been doing for years, and we still have different understanding what that means. So you talked about two different types of Conmon: monthly, which to my understanding only includes vulnerability scans, and then annual assessments are the actual assessments of the controls or portion of the controls.
Correct.
So for monthly, the scans are performed by CSPs. For control assessments, for the Conmon piece, who's responsible? Is each customer agency, does each customer agency have to do its own assessments, or are those inheritable?
Well, if you're a SaaS, obviously, you're inheriting from the stack, but this is for the annual assessments. That's where we see involvement from the cloud providers with 3 PAOs. The 3 PAOs will come in and do basically a mini assessment based on the controls that are identified that are required for that annual.
So the cloud service provider contracts the 3 PAO, and then agencies inherit those or can reuse those assessments.
Yeah, we see that we get the reports, and then when it's satisfactorily completed, we inform the cloud provider that their annual assessment's been passed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. It looks like there are no. Well,
I have a question.
Go. You have a question.
Yeah, just trying to squeak it in right. Yeah, I have one more question as well. I'll go after you both. You sure? All right. Okay, I can go. Brian, I had a quick question. Will the new authorization boundary guidance that comes out in the future reflect public comment feedback that was given out by FedRAMP stakeholders
Yes.
in past public comment periods?
Yes.
And when will the new authorization boundary guidance come out?
There's a couple things that we have to reconcile with there. So hopefully we're hoping by the end of next month at the latest.
Thank you, Brian. So do we have to reflect that during our next annual assessment as CSPs?
It depends on when your annual assessment is.
Thank you, Brian.
I do want to clarify that the question and answer period is only for members of the FSCAC only at this point in time. Public comment will be later in the agenda. So for right now, please only have the members ask questions. Bo, go ahead with your question.
Hey, thanks for that. Hey, Brian, good to see you again.
Likewise.
I'm curious, the one pager that you mentioned, I believe, I've seen these, typically speaking, they effectively go through and characterize the OS web database and have some particulars around the age of the vulnerabilities and some relevant notes from the team. How broadly are these distributed? You mentioned they go to the AOs. Are they distributed directly to those teams? Do they get published directly to Max, and the presumption is that the associated teams supporting the AOs go off and get it for their dependent set systems, which I think is very well possible, but realistically, I'm not sure how active individualized agencies may be in going off and bringing down 20, 30 different SaaS, PaaS, IaaS type solutions to really be able to more broadly define what their risk posture is across their cloud ecosystem. You mentioned earlier that there was some work happening with CDM to be able to characterize this. Can you expand just on that a little bit? Because I feel as if, as a CISO, it would be incredibly important for me to actually have, the same level of visibility for the as the AO, certainly, but more broadly than that, just understanding the overall risk picture, not just for one CSP, but the collective set of CSPs. So the work that you're doing with the CDM program, I think, is fundamental because it does provide that broader set visibility in terms of aggregate risk versus individual CSP risk. Exactly.
And that's why we decided to go down this path. So to back up to the first part of your comments, presently, when the legacy JAB does continuous monitoring, they publish the web one pagers. Those are briefed out amongst the review team leads and the reviewers in the PMO monthly. They're posted to their repository site. And yes, the presumption and assumption is that agencies will be active in going to OMB Max and pulling down that information. While that works in the interim, we're concerned and we want to make sure that we're more active, and FedRAMP is more active in pushing that information out to the folks that need to see it. And that's one of the reasons why we partnered with CDM to begin with, where we're collecting this information and it's kind of asking the question, what do I know and who needs to know it? And so it makes sense to leverage what is available in the federal government to help distribute this information out to authorizing officials and CISOs so they can make better risk-based decisions. And so the idea is, even with the legacy JAB CSOs, is going that route, is not hanging them on in the repository anymore, but looking at using CDM to distribute more broadly.
Are you guys exploring that same option with the agency authorization?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the things that we're looking at, because again, we don't have our fingers on exactly how well agencies, or if an agency is authorized a cloud service, how well they're doing continuous monitoring. And so by standing up the Conmon lane in the PMO, and by looking at, first the FedRAMP compliance, making sure they're complying with the cloud providers are complying with all of our requirements and holding them to account for that. But then also providing, we know at this point that agency authorizing officials are getting the data that they need. Not, the onus won't be on them to make it happen. We're making it happen for them. And then as we see it, if we see weird things going on, we'll be able to reach out to those agencies and say, hey, did you see this kind of thing going on? And that will, help close the loop in terms of communicating that.
And just final question, the ConMon related review requirements you mentioned earlier are corresponded to just the monthly OS web database scans and then the corresponding updates to the poems for the control related findings. Do you find as if, like in October 2023, where we sit today, that for the types of cloud service solutions that are being forwarded for FedRAMP authorization, that OS web and database scans in and of themselves are wholly reflective of the overall corresponded set of risks, cyber hygiene risks, for how some of these cloud service solutions are being delivered? We've got API integrations everywhere. We've got multi-cloud integrations everywhere. We've got microservices. We've got API, container-related solutions. Are we consuming all the right or asking for all of the right set of data to be able to really understand true cyber hygiene across these cloud service environments?
That's an excellent question. And I would say that we're working off our jumping off point, our foundational point is what we have now. As we start to mature in what we look at, we can start looking at those other things and providing that information as well. But to get us started, especially down the road of how we're going to automate and get this information out to agency authorizing officials or risk managers is understanding what we have now and running with that, and then using opportunities to expand and provide even more information.
I mentioned this, Brian, because I'm working with a cloud service provider that has no web servers, no database servers, and no infrastructure of their own, that is essentially leveraging microservices to effectively deliver a lot of these capabilities. So typically speaking, when you ask for show me your scans, they don't have any.
Understood. Okay. That's good to take back to the team. I appreciate that, Bo.
All right, great. Do any of the other members from FSCAC have any questions they would like to ask Brian? Jackie, you have another question?
I do. I was just going to tag on the last comments. And Brian, one of the concerns I have had is that primarily ConMon is focused on the management plane infrastructure, and where we have predominance of SaaS these days and a lot of PaaS. Have we considered at least doing a ConMon associated with the software that's sitting on top of a lot of these things, that what that baseline image looks like for a tenant or what that PaaS looks like, so that we can ensure that what gets fielded into the mission plane is actually patched and where the risk is for those? Over.
We haven't, but again, that's an excellent, again, looking at where we can go in terms of opportunities, that's great information to take back as well.
Thanks, Brian.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. I did want to check with John to make sure that do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
Sure. And Brian, thank you for a great presentation. This is John Greenstein with Bluescape. Sort of a follow-on question that kind of builds on what Jackie mentioned a little earlier. She threw out a statistic, which I think was great, but also horrifying, that for every 20 cloud service providers, I think she said somewhere north, over $1 million of additional cost to do ConMon. I'm curious if you have some sort of analog on your end for each other cloud service provider who goes through the FedRAMP process. If that's like a calculation you have, or any metrics that you speak to, because obviously, where this is going, to your introductory kickoff comments for this, a few months ago, we want to get more vendors through this process. And I'm just wondering how much of a barrier ConMon is for your team in terms of people and cost. So I don't know if there's any comments you can make on that.
So we have a team of contractors that supports our efforts right now. We're, again, hiring a federal professional to stand up that lane more formally within the PMO. From the agency aspect, we have a rough estimate as Jackie provided, but on the agency side, FedRAMP hasn't really been involved in the agency continuous monitoring aspect. When we hear of something that's gone awry with a cloud provider, it's usually us, jumping in and saying, hey, what's up with this incident? That kind of thing, and going back to the agencies and saying, do you understand what's going on here? What are you doing about it? That kind of thing, in working with the cloud provider. But we don't necessarily have visibility on what each of the individual agencies are doing with regards to continuous monitoring. Some agencies, I know Bo runs a really tight ship over at GSA, and so he can probably nail down the cost of continuous monitoring that he's spending every month for the systems, for the cloud providers, the FedRAMP authorized cloud systems that they're using. I'm not sure if I could go to every agency and get the same level of information, or with the same, accuracy. And that's part of the issue, is we want to try and normalize a lot more what's happening inside of what agencies are doing to be more active with continuous monitoring. And the fact of the matter is that, cloud providers need to understand that, the authorization is not the end state. The authorization is just the beginning, and the responsibilities behind that to maintain the system, to maintain the FSMA standards, as outlined in the FedRAMP baselines, is absolutely critical, and maintaining the FedRAMP requirements as well. So I couldn't really answer that question with any level of accuracy at all.
Right, great. Are there any final questions for Brian before he departs?
But if I could tag on, this is Jackie. Brian, do you know what it costs? Because obviously I'm one of your TRs that does Conmon for the FedRAMP. Do you know what the FedRAMP budget is for performing Conmon? Inclusive of the TR, the 3 TRs that support you?
Okay, so each of the TR teams is 80% of, so back of the envelope calculation that we have is that JAB review teams are doing 80% of their time is spent on continuous monitoring, versus 20% of towards initial authorizations. And so, taking that number and, using 80% of that would be a, kind of hip pocket number I would use.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you all for the discussion, and thank you, Brian, for your informative presentation and providing more context around Conmon. We are now at the point in our agenda where we would like to welcome the public to unmute themselves and share their comments. To our speakers again, please note a timer will be displayed on the screen indicating your time remaining. An alert will indicate you're out of time. We are on a tight schedule today, so please be respectful of the time. Each speaker is allotted 3 minutes to make their comments. We will be interrupting and, if needed, muting speakers who exceed 3 minutes. So please speak succinctly and be respectful of time. As a reminder, all public comments submitted by Wednesday, October 18th, were presented to the committee members prior to this meeting. Please raise your hand if you wish to provide comment, and I will call on you to unmute yourself in the order in which you raised your hand. I will now invite people one at a time to speak. Do we have any public commenters? All right. We appear not to have any public commenters, so we will go ahead and move to the.
This is Jason Weiss. I don't see a button on Zoom for me to raise my hand. May I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead, Jason.
Given OMB's RFC for updated guidance for modernizing the FedRAMP being published in tomorrow's Federal Register, I was curious if this committee has had any input or a preview of that document.
Again, this is our public comment is just kind of a one-way discussion. So our committee is not going to be privy to answer that, but we did make note of your comment.
All right, thank you much.
Any other public comments? Okay, this concludes our public comment section for today. Thank you all to the speakers and joining us and your comments. I would like to now invite the committee to join a discussion to determine what improvements the ConMon process they would like to propose in their final deliverable to the GSA administrator. For this session, we will be live capturing your comments as notes in the screen, on the screen, and the draft deliverable for a future meeting. Please review your comments as captured, and should anything be mistyped or stated, please feel free to correct the capture immediately to avoid any misunderstanding by raising your hand and noting the correction. As acting for Anne as the committee chair, I'd like to start with start the meeting with a discussion of focusing on program level improvements for continuous monitoring. What is ConMon doing now and what it should be doing in the future? How well is the process currently working? Where are the bottlenecks? What are the costs? Opportunities for improvement. We know that the process involves a series of security and compliance checks of software as software evolves over time and its risks and threats evolve, and the needs and the customers evolve. So are there any places where the scope of the process and the depth of the process should change? For some improved ConMon processes, how do we know how well the process is working? How well can the process scale? What happens when the security landscape changes over time? How will we know what success looks like? What are we measuring? What should we measure? What data should FedRAMP be more transparent with? And how do we know what the future process of working and scaling? Again, don't worry about wordsmithing today. We have the support staff, knowledge capturing and our draft deliverable live with us. And we will have, following the same kind of format that we did in our last session, we will have a 10 minutes to discuss our problem statements, 10 minutes to discuss goals, 10 minutes to discuss considerations, and then 25 minutes we've allotted for the recommendations. So let's go ahead and open the floor to our problem statements. Does anybody have any items that can fall under the problem statements? What problems are we trying to solve? Lamont, go ahead.
Yes, and I kind of had some dialogue with Brian about this earlier, but I do think that the non-existent and again qualifying that he did say he's going to instantiate, part of the plan is to instantiate it, but I do think the non-existence of a centralized solution from the FedRAMP PMO perspective limits the ConMon phase of the CSP authorization process. And it kind of highlights an inability to kind of, automatically monitor risk near real time or real time, preferably, which perhaps can negatively impact or delay agencies' risk-based decisions. So that's, a pain point because, CSP ConMons, they're, usually conducted on a monthly basis across the federal agencies, but the information being assessed as portrayed within POAMs cannot be considered again in near real time, monitoring, a near real time monitoring capability. So the implementation of said solution, I think ultimately would assist us, specifically agency AOs and for CISOs, to the point that Bo made, happen to serve as both in my agency, to faster to more quickly rather identify new threats and changes to the security posture of systems, which could, support ultimately, timely and informed risk-based decisions.
All right, great. Thanks, Lamont. Ravi, you're next.
Yeah, one of the problem statement can be today, we are spending about 80% time doing Kanban. By how much we want to reduce that to? Do we want it to be 20%, 50%?
All right, great. Thanks, Ravi. Branko.
So I think actually, before I go into my comment, Ravi's comment is probably more appropriate for the goal. That's not necessarily a problem statement. It's just my recommendation. I think the problem statement that actually captures the problem we're trying to solve is that the current continuous monitoring process is inefficient. It is manual, costly, labor intensive, and does not contribute or does not improve, does not significantly improve the security posture of the CSP offerings.
Right, great. Jackie.
He got mine, and I would tag on that it doesn't improve the risk visibility to those leveraging the cloud offering either. But too labor intensive, too costly, not enough risk visibility is the same comment.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Marcy.
Thank you. I was going to focus on the SCR process as part of Kanban so that essentially the Kanban process does not capture the frequency, the impacts, and the complexity of significant changes and what that does in the overall larger picture of the offering's risk posture and how agencies kind of interact with the offering and that change.
Great, thanks, Marcy. Bo, you're next.
Yeah, I was going to help my friend Bronco a little bit, just finish off, I think, his idea, particularly from a problem standpoint. I think he enumerated the first part accurately. I think the challenge here is that, and this is, I think, where Ravi is going as well, in that the 80-20 split is effectively impeding or, having an outsized effect on consumption of the limited FedRAMP budgets, thereby contributing to less resources going to A&A and contributing to delays, associated with, getting faster FedRAMP authorizations overall, right? So, if you've got $100 and $80 is going to Kanban and 20 going to A&As, then likelihood, if you're asking the question, why does FedRAMP take so long? Well, only 20% of that overall budget is essentially going to the FedRAMP assessment and authorization. And a lot of it is going towards the management and maintenance of those vendors that already have authorizations. So I think from a problem standpoint, this is a contributing factor to the overall challenges that we were talking about last week. One other thing here, I do think that, Kanban may not be capturing all of the relevant risks, cyber hygiene or otherwise, relative to newer architecture patterns. So the focus on OS, web, and database, that made sense, I think, perhaps at the founding of FedRAMP, but I don't know that it makes a lot of sense today. There are a lot of other sets of contributing, resources that can be found in cloud environments whose vulnerabilities may not necessarily be gleaned from traditional OS web config scans generally. I think another point here is that agencies, this again is from a federal standpoint, may not be consuming these monthly cybersecurity risk reports for their individual CSPs or for their agencies on an aggregated basis. I think that's a problem area that we need to effectively look into. You know, it would almost make sense for us to, and perhaps through CISA, through CDM, look at creating an agency FedRAMP snapshot that reflects the aggregate risk for all CSPs that an agency is consuming. You know, placing it up on Max and then expecting, you know, monthly consumption of 30, 40 different CSP solutions. While it places that responsibility, realistically, something's not going to happen there. And I think the last point that I'd like to make is, you know, JAB and agency Conmon processes, the variance between what the JAB does and the correspondence, particularly from a review, monitoring, and attention to agency authorizations, that's a source of concern. The entire notion of FedRAMP is that, you know, they're aligned to the same requirements, same standards, process, et cetera. And if Conmon is not sufficiently happening at the agency level, it essentially is a race to the bottom. We need to be able to go through and ensure consistent, equitable security monitoring, regardless of the authorization type.
All right, great. Thanks, Bo. Ravi, you're next.
Yeah, one of the problem statement comes to my mind is how Conmon is inherently complex. How do we make it palatable for smaller companies?
All right, great. Thanks, Ravi. Branko.
Just wanted to follow up on my earlier question for Brian. I feel that we need to define somewhere in the problem statement what we mean by Conmon, and that's split into two types of monthly vulnerability scans and annual control assessments. Because again, the term means different things for different.
I'm carrying two calls at the same time right now, Amy. This just got added to my calendar late last night, so I couldn't ditch the other one. So I'm more in a listen mode today.
You have an open mic. Okay. So yeah, that was just my comment that we should probably capture the definition somewhere, and problem statement may be a good section to do that.
Okay, great, thanks. Jackie, you're next.
I wanted to follow on the previous comment ago between the agency and the FedRAMP processes. And I think a problem statement is, and I heard some of this last week, is we have a bifurcation between FedRAMP and the agency processes. And by that, I mean, we're not sharing and looking at GRC for all cloud. We're looking at solving the problem for FedRAMP. And so, you know, and then how we do agency Conmon versus how we do JAB Conmon. And so it just seems to me that as we move forward in terms of looking at risk, as the previous person had described, we've got to look at the holistic risk across all of the cloud providers. We need common standards. At Carasoft's Cloud Summit, it was very interesting that one of the panels had a participant that told the agencies, you can sponsor a cloud service offering, you don't have to do Conmon. And so that to me indicated a training issue, that an understanding of what's required in the process. And we don't have really consistent standards, application, and ingest of this data to inform risk across the federal government. And so it just seems to me that we've got to figure out the goal would be to unify. The problem statement is today, I think we're bifurcated.
Right, great, thanks, Jackie. Bo, do you have another comment? Bo, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. Yes. Quick thought, particularly around, the continuous monitoring relative to changes corresponding to the cloud service solutions themselves, particularly things that would typically be captured within customer responsibilities. Those customer responsibilities inherently at the end of the day are the basis for achievement of secure deployments of cloud across individualized federal agencies. And those tend to be very static, and those tend to be incredibly high level. And, to the effect that certain agencies, including my own, were essentially going outside of the FedRAMP authorization package to determine secure configuration deployments for our cloud service solution, be it SaaS, PaaS, or whatever. So I think there's a need to evaluate the CRM element and the level of detail correspondent to those CRMs to ensure secure configuration outcomes. And one other thought here, particularly around, more pressing BODs, EDs, Ms. These are memorandas coming through the administration. There should be consideration, particularly through those monthly snapshot reports, in terms of how CSPs are comporting to those. I guess the problem statement right now is that the monthly ConMon reports do not reflect alignment to BOD, EDs, and Ms that apply to federal government.
All right, great, thanks, Bo. Mike, you have a question, or not a question, a comment for the problem statement?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem statement from the CSP perspective, we're looking at OSCAL, right, from an automated tools perspective. So are there opportunities for us to help, bring our near real-time or real-time type of system in place through machine readable language and systems? And do we have that type of capability available in the federal government today? And if not, can we get something like that in place where we could do these, more automated type submissions and assessments that would hopefully reduce Jackie's burden of 80/20, right? Some of the other things we're looking at too, what are our metrics and indicators? Like, how do we want to actually define the risk level that's acceptable? Is it the same for all agencies, or is it the same across different FedRAMP levels? What's sort of the reporting cadence or mechanism? Are we doing enough right now? Are we really protecting and reporting fast enough in the current cadence? And then really, what is the feedback loop? I think would be important. Like, how does the government want to hold industry responsible? How does industry want to make sure that we're reporting and getting the right information to the government? I think all of those sort of packaged together into like, what are we trying to achieve with this ConMon, and how can we improve it?
Right,
I put some of that in the chat too, so no problem.
And Bill.
Hey, thanks. Bill on SEC. I kind of feel like we are dancing around a little bit, and maybe I'm just being overly pedantic here and stating the obvious out loud, that some of these inconsistencies that we're talking about in the end-to-end, particularly like agency, et cetera, it all comes down to the fact that, the way that FSMA is written, there's no such thing as like a centralized acceptance of risk at the end of the day. We have a lot of authority that's been given at the individual level to each individual CIO. And so we do end up with a lot of this sort of redundancy and inconsistency from implementation. The JAB, can not really accept the risks for the agency at the end of the day, because FSMA assigns that back individually to CIOs. So just pointing out here the very, very obvious upstream policy issue of, no one can accept that risk for the entire federal government, and thus that leaves a lot of these things to be just repeating ourselves and inconsistent from place to place. So tagging on to what a couple of the others, Jackie and others, were talking about.
Great, thanks, Bill. Let's go ahead and move on to our goals. We already have the one that Ravi had suggested, but does anyone have any other recommendation of what our goals should look like?
So
I was going to say, I was just calling on you.
Yes. So I kind of have like really high level ones that I think in general are some of what we should be attempting to do. So like, I don't know if they're goals or more like visionary, just like where I see CONMON going, but basically maintaining an up-to-date security and risk posture is probably the most important thing that we're looking at with this. That way the government knows that CSPs are, you know, up to date, we're patched, we're not vulnerable, all of our imagers are safe. The second one I would say is to detect and respond to changes in the environments or threats. So we all know how quickly 0 days are coming out. How, you know, are we responsive enough as CSPs to get those out to protect our customers? And then the third one I really see is around the risk management decisions that the government wants to make to allow us to understand, like, what is the risk posture? What do we see as good enough, right? And if we need to make things more stringent over time, do we have a process that we could go through to continuously raise the bar on CONMON without raising it too high that we have barriers of entry for smaller and mid-sized business?
Great, thank you so much, Bronco.
So I'm now reconsidering what I was going to say, if it fits under goals or recommendations, but acceleration of automation, the efforts on automation, specifically ingestion of some of this CONMON data into CISA repository that would allow us to share this information across the agency customers, well, should probably be a goal and also a consideration. And this would then lead to the improvement of some of those things that were addressed in the problem statement. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Anyone else have any suggestions for goals? All right, well, let's go ahead and move to considerations. What considerations do we need to have? Go ahead, Jackie.
Yeah, I was back on the goals, sorry. And I just would like to proffer that we should consider an integrated GRC for agencies and FedRAMP authorizations that can ingest CONMON, annual assessment, and change request data for an integrated risk picture.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Ravi.
Yeah, so this is maybe under considerations. I think we should consider the timeline for the automation of CONMON from the perspective of the FedRAMP PMO and the CSPs and the 3PAO from all three perspectives. And publishing such a timeline, our timeline to publish such a timeline will be helpful.
All right, great, thanks. Bill, you're next.
Just tagging on to that, good, fast, cheap, right? So also need to talk about the costs associated with it and whether or not that can fit within the current program budget as designed with the timelines that we're trying to achieve here. That I know has been a topic that's come up in this group a couple of times already.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Bo.
I think we need to look at developing a common reference architecture for what an integrated EGRC means. And to me, an EGRC isn't singular to or insular to FedRAMP, but rather integrates with a broader set of EGRC solutions leveraged across government and industry. And part and parcel of that is, the CRM, again, I harp on that, the customer responsibilities. At the end of the day, our bifurcated responsibility model essentially corresponds to the vendor doing its thing, and then agencies ultimately securely configuring their instance. That's where the level of security achieved is ultimately achieved. So the CRM elements, especially with this fast forward movement to cloud, if these CRMs are not are considered very manual and don't propagate in an automated way when there are changes to systems into any EGRC solution, it's going to imperil the level of security that we ultimately have at a tenant level. So I think a goal really needs to be to examine development of a common reference architecture for an integrated EGRC ecosystem with automated update of customer responsibilities and any related, cloud service provider metadata that would help customers as well as the vendor overall in terms of a shared understanding. It probably does not make sense to reflect security data, but high-level metadata, particularly around the CSP solution and the CRMs, would be a great place to start.
Okay, fantastic. Any other considerations that we should consider? All right, let's go ahead and move to our recommendations. What recommendations do we want to include? And Bo, do you have a recommendation?
I would say I would start with the last, I guess, is consideration or recommendation, tomato, tomato. But I think we need to actually have an equitable sharing of resources. It seems as if 80 cents on the dollar is going to Conmon and 20 cents on the dollar to go to FedRAMP authorizations, some of the challenges that our vendor partners face are perhaps in part related to that, that distribution of resources accordingly. So, a fix to Conmon, I think, is a fix to FedRAMP.
Okay, great, thanks, Bo. Branko.
Just going back to my consideration, I think this is also part of recommendation, accelerate the ingestion or not necessarily, since ingestion is still not happening, that work to allow ingestion of Conmon data into CISA environment.
Great, thanks. Mike.
Yeah, I'm just gonna beat that same drum. I think this is gonna need automation and a system that automatically allows for ingestion and processing. I don't see us being able to meet the scale of all of the CSPs and all of these companies that are coming online without that. It's going to be key for our success. And of course, along with that goes OSCAL adoption and whatever else we need to make sure that we're able to do this in an automated system way.
Great, thanks, Mike. Robbie.
So what are my recommendation is, how do we maintain some sort of simplicity in this complex environment, right? So there is no point in making it even more complex. How can we maintain an overarching goal to, maintain simplicity in all of this?
Great, thanks, Robbie. Jackie.
One recommendation I'd like us to consider is some interim solutions. I think automation is a good ways off, just based on my conversations. And I'd like us to see, what we have done in DoD is we've moved to every other month or once a quarter Conmon, depending on, who the authorizing entity is. just because we've got to reduce cost and gain some efficiencies. So I'd really like to see some sort of interim measures to provide a view into risk and make this data visible to people, to the authorizing officials around the community, as well as to reduce some of the burden and gain back some efficiencies and on the authorization side.
All right, great. Thanks, Jackie. Marcy.
I would recommend that within the program to define essentially like a minimum acceptable standard for things such as SCRs, finding counts for continued authorization. We see those things on the JAB side, and they are defined, but on the agency authorization side, it's kind of a free-for-all. And for good reason to some extent, but again, if we are creating roles by exception, then we're never going to have a role. So in the case of an SCR, what is or is not an SCR, the minimum baseline, and the same thing for acceptable number of findings and monthly continuous monitoring vuln scans. But on really defining that minimum standard, I think would be key to streamlining and finding efficiencies.
Thanks, Marcy. Jim.
Hey, yeah, Jackie and Marcy actually took most of what I was about to say out of my mouth, so +1 to what they said. But on a more general scale, in addition to looking at kind of what Jackie said about maybe things only need to be done every other month or once a quarter or things like that. But someone said it earlier when we were talking, and I forget who it was, so apologies there, about reassessing what exactly needs to be part of the vulnerability scans every month. I know as a CSP, it seems like we spend half our time chasing false positives and vulnerabilities related because we haven't run Windows updates for the month yet or things like that. So database, web, and OS scans are great, but there likely needs to be whether it be a task force or what is it, what have you, to look for something, look for ways to improve. If you're leveraging an infrastructure, maybe that infrastructure needs to have its own scans, things like that, to try to really go after what's truly a risk, something that's in a more modern world and the world of microservices and leveraging platforms and infrastructures.
All right, great. Thanks, Jim. Bo. Bo, if you're speaking, you're on mute still.
Yeah, +1 to Jim. So let me stomp that one. And I think the other thing is I would highly recommend centralizing all ConMon for agency authorizations with FedRAMP. And if everybody's doing it, everything that everybody's been talking about, Marcy included, around significant change, it's going to be problematic, all right? And because every agency is going to have their own interpretive guidance, and this is all a matter of shared risk, and shared risk, particularly around a ConMon function, if done right, automated, should be centralized. And then I did make a problem statement earlier, particularly around agencies' visibility into risk across their CSP ecosystem. So the recommendation is really a doubling down of the integration of CSP ConMon data into the CDM stack, with a per agency risk score as well as a per CSP risk score that essentially provides the analytics really needed to be able to understand shared risk across government.
All right, great. Thanks, Bo. Mike.
Bo actually just took exactly what I was going to touch on. I think that ingestion and the health score or risk score is really important. That way we have a way to focus in and understand the data that's coming, especially at the volume it'll come at.
Okay, fantastic. Any other recommendations that we should focus on? Bo.
I think there needs to be a broader look at resources again. I mean, there's so many great ideas here, both in terms of problems, considerations, recommendations, but everything is infinitely possible. But it's just a matter of prioritizing and appropriately resourcing it. So I think all of these recommendations really have to be, prioritized, and then a look through from a resourcing standpoint, just to make sure that, we're not, enriching one function at the cost of another. We should essentially be enriching both functions, the assessment, authorizations, and conmons, if this is really an agency and national priority.
Great. Thanks, Bo. With that, I will move on to our next section, which I do think that we should hold off on our trade-offs until we decide our final recommendations. So we'll do that on the 9th, but we'll go down to the impact on stakeholders. For CSPs, 3PAOs, and agencies, does anybody have any impacts that they would like to identify here? Jackie.
I think the positive impact, I guess impact could be both positive and negative, but the positive impact to the CSPs through automation is that they can use their tooling to produce OSCAL or other compliant XML type of input into all of our processes. So I think this would reduce the cost on the CSPs. At least that would be my hope.
Right, great, thanks, Jackie. Anybody else? What about the 3PAO community? What are the impacts for that community?
I would say, this is Marcy, Shaman. I would say that if we're talking about, sorry to harp on this again, SCRs, currently for any like new feature or service, the recommended control set is well over 100, which is really high, and that increases time and costs for CSPs, and obviously impacts the efficiency from the assessment side. So we're talking about decreasing level of effort and cost to both CSPs and 3PAOs.
Okay, great. Mike.
Yeah, on the CSP side, I think there's also, the general business sense, right? Like we could drive more services through the FedRAMP process and increase our revenues, which is always our bottom line. So I think from that perspective, like anything we do in this space that allows Conmon to take cost less and to take up less of the agency's time will allow us to get more services accredited faster, which will allow us to drive more innovation into the government space. Which I think on the agency side, allowing more innovation, more services, it just increases the rate of change.
And Branko, you're next on.
Yeah, we must remember ultimately while we are doing all this, the goal is not cost reduction. The goal is to improve the security of the federal enterprise. Therefore, the impact to stakeholder number one impact to federal agencies and federal enterprise is the reduction in risk reduction in federal enterprise.
Okay, great, thank you. Jackie.
To go along with that, I think it's really visibility, better visibility of risks of leveraging particular CSOs.
Okay, great. Bo.
Yeah, I agree with everything, particularly in the agency buckets. We're here focused on ensuring resiliency, driving down risks, and that comes through clear and transparent visibility an understanding of, what services we're getting and the security therein from the CSP providers. So the first 3 bullets there. I think the other one really is a shared understanding of risk. Increasingly, we're all effectively making home in the same exact environment. And in some cases living in multi-tenant, some cases single tenant environments. And there is a greater shared risk concern, as it relates to the CSP, in other cases with perhaps tenants in multi-tenant type environments where an incident to one impacts all customers. And you need only look at, some of the recent broad-based incidents, including the one that just hit the news this week. So having that broad-based understanding and looking at it from a collective standpoint of shared risk is incredibly important.
Great, thanks, Bo. Any other impacts to stakeholders that we want to discuss here? Jackie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm actually going to back kind of up to the top, but as we've been talking, I think one of the problems we have is that we don't have visibility into the metrics of cost and resources surrounding each of these components. And it seems to me one of our goals should be to be able to measure our performance in these areas and our costs so that we understand the impacts of solutions to improving things like risk and driving down things like cost and inefficiencies.
All right, great. Any other comments? And I'm going to open that up for the entire I guess, recommendation portion. So if you have any comments on the recommendations or the problem statement, please think of them now. We are running a little ahead of schedule. So one of the things that we can focus on with our remaining time is taking a look at what we have already discussed and see if we can combine some of these comments. We have a lot of problem statements. So one of the challenges that we're going to have is trying to create some problem statements that captures all of these. Are any of these related to each other so that we could potentially group them together? Bo, go ahead.
Just something, that's come to mind. I mean, oftentimes there's this notion of compliance, being, challenged with, operational security, and a lot of times compliance gets a bad rap. But I would, ask that question particularly around, is a FedRAMP compliant package and the corresponding CRM result in a secure configuration deployment?
No.
We need to effectively ensure that we're empowering federal agencies to ensure secure configuration deployments. If we're not able to do that as a function of the FedRAMP authorization, that comes at a cost to all 3 stakeholders, the government, the vendor, as well as our 3 POWs.
If I could tag on to Bo's comment, one of the things that for our SaaS providers, and I'm just going to use O365 as an example, we have a tenant configuration guide that spells out how the mission owners have to secure that SaaS from a tenant perspective. And so we look at a lot of our SaaSes and work towards doing tenant configuration guides. And to your point, in my world, that's almost analogous to the customer responsibility matrix. At the SaaS point, people think I just am going to use that SaaS. They don't realize they have to go that next step, which is to configure that SaaS. And so as we start to look at SaaSes more and more, and that's what we're seeing the preponderance of in the department, making sure a deliverable is a tenant configuration guide so that they know what really has to be secured and how they secure it. So Bo, I couldn't agree anymore with you. I mean, it's just a really solid point.
Great, thanks so much. Bo.
Yeah, Jackie, it's great that your team is doing that because that's exactly where we find ourselves at GSA, right? And I look at a leveraged authorization package that speak to the customer responsibilities, and then I scratch my head and ask that basic question. So we end up going through and creating a secure configuration profile document that enumerates all of the configuration options, the range of configuration parameters, the defined setting that we ended up going with. And ultimately, that is that CRM. And I think there is that mismatch right now. And to the extent that, every customer agency has to do it for themselves. And I think the bigger risk is that a lot of folks are not doing this and they're just leaning on the CRM document that treats this more like a compliance exercise as opposed to security exercise, which is really the ultimate goal. So somehow, somewhere within this discussion, I think we have to go through and make sure that we're delivering on that.
Yeah, and if I could tag on to the conversation, which is hopefully illuminating for others, is the fact that FedRAMP is really focused on the cloud infrastructure piece. And what we're monitoring is the cloud infrastructure. And so I was alluding to that earlier, which is how do we start to get visibility of what the PaaS, if something's authorized for a PaaS or a SaaS, how do I actually get a look at what that PaaS looks like? Because that's where the risk is to the person that hosts an application. How do I get a look at what that SaaS image looks like when they use infrastructure as code to deploy a SaaS? How do I get a look at that image so that I can make a risk decision as to whether I'm going to host my data? And so FedRAMP is very focused on the infrastructure, making sure that infrastructure is secure. But what are we doing to inform the risk on the other side? So this gets to the CRM of the controls, the tenant configuration guides, or the platform configuration guides that are really necessary, and understanding of the risk on what I would term the mission plane. And so to me, so I sit on both sides of this problem, as I'm an AO of systems that host in the cloud, and I'm the department's authorizing official for the cloud providers. So it is a really interesting mix to experience both of these, and that visibility of configuration guidance and what things look like is really, really tough when I go to authorize a system. And that's from somebody who looks at all of the packages that come through when I authorize the cloud provider.
All right, great. Thanks, Jackie. Marcy.
Thanks, Marcy Shulman. I definitely see the value in both what Bo and Jackie is stating. I would argue that that's not really the configuration guide, is perhaps something that could be added to the package, essentially, that a cloud service provider submits with an offering. It's like another appendix or addendum to the system security planning. It ties everything together, but I don't believe that's really the intent of the customer responsibility matrix. Like the CRM is intended to say, hey, agency implementing this technology, this is what you need to be responsible for, because sometimes the agency is going to be responsible for something that cannot be configured within the cloud offering. So I wanted to distinguish between the two, because there's merit, absolutely, but I don't think that the CRM, that's its purpose.
Great. Any other comments or things that the committee members would like to state? All right, well, with that, thank you all for the discussion. We will now move to the final topic in our agenda today with closing remarks and adjournment. I'd like to thank everyone for joining for this productive discussion. I think we came up with some really great recommendations and captured some helpful notes around CONMON. And that this will really help building out our final deliverable. We look forward to having another discussion like today's at our meeting next week. Thank you all again for joining. With that, I will now go ahead and adjourn the meeting at this time. Thank you. See you next week.
Take care.